Welcome to Wallace and Wire. Today, we're talking about Howard Lee's very strong statements recently, specifically regarding how funding for Chinese schools is being handled now under the unity government.
Yeah, it's kicked up quite a bit of discussion. Lee's basically claiming this is, well, a historical watershed moment for Chinese education. Big words.
Definitely big words. And our goal here is to sort of unpack that claim. What's behind it? Is it just politics, or is there a real policy shift happening?
Exactly, because the core tension here is this idea of institutionalized funding versus the old way, the politics of patronage.
Right, relying on favors, essentially.
And Lee's statement is a direct counter to critics who are saying, look, the details are still murky. We don't see the money clearly allocated.
Okay, so let's start with that phrase, historical watershed. What does Howard Lee actually mean by that? What's supposed to be so historic?
Well, his argument is that for the very first time, the construction needs of Chinese primary schools are being formally written into the National Development Blueprint.
You mean like the main government plans?
Yes, specifically the Malaysia 5-year plan, the RMK, and crucially, the Rolling Development Plan mechanism that sits within it.
Okay, the rolling development plan. Why is that the key part? What changes when funding gets put in there?
Because that changes the whole game.
Yeah.
See, Lee argues that putting it into this formal plan, this national system, removes the huge risk they always faced before.
What risk was that?
The risk of, what can be granted can also be withdrawn. That's his exact phrasing. Funding used to depend heavily on who was prime minister or finance minister at the time,
So a grant could be announced 1 year.
and then disappear the next if the political winds change. Lee says integrating it into the national system ends the need to kneel and beg for funds from individuals
Okay, so it shifts from a personal appeal, maybe based on relationships.
to a systematic guarantee. It's supposed to be policy, not personality, driving the funding. That's the watershed moment he's describing.
Right. Let's contrast that. Let's really get into what that old way, the one Lee criticizes, actually looked like.
Okay. So the previous methods, which Lee calls the exception rather than the norm, were pretty precarious.
Like what, specifically?
Well, you had things like special allocation, the PRK. These were often one-off project-specific funds. Or maybe you'd get a sudden pot of money directly from the Prime Minister's department. Or maybe the Treasury found some extra funds, often quite, unpredictable.
And sometimes tied to things like developer contributions, right? Corporate responsibility.
Exactly. Also not systematic. The point is, none of it was built into the core government development budget as a regular expected item.
So the old model was basically, as Lee puts it, getting by fighting lardo or relying on relationships. You had to lobby hard.
Precisely. And Lee's claim is that the unity government has taken that exceptional fight-forward approach and turned it into a formalized system.
Transforming fighting into a guarantee, that sounds like a pretty fundamental shift.
It's presented as exactly that, a move away from politics based on favors towards something more like systemic fairness.
But then you have the critic saying, hold on, we can't actually see the figures clearly listed for specific schools. They question if this institutionalization is, real on paper.
Yes, and Lee directly pushes back on that. He argues that demanding to see money specifically named next to a school is actually thinking in the old way, the patronage way.
How so?
Because in the old system, if your school wasn't explicitly named on some special allocation list, you couldn't be sure the money was safe, right? It needed that political spotlight.
That political show transparency, as Lee calls it.
Exactly. Lee insists they're moving towards system transparency. The guarantee isn't seeing a specific line item for school aid this year. It's knowing the funds are secured within the Ministry of Education's overall development budget, managed through that rolling plan mechanism.
So the transparency is in the structure, not necessarily in the individual listing for every single project up front.
That's the argument. The structure itself is meant to ensure the funds are there when needed according to the plan.
Okay, but people still want to follow the money. Critics are suggesting maybe this institutionalization is just talk, maybe funds are actually being cut, or there's zero allocation because it's not earmarked in the old way. Does Lee offer specific figures to counter this?
He does. He points to the overall education budget first, saying the allocation for the upcoming 2026 budget is heading towards 80 billion ringgit.
80 billion! That's huge!
He cites it as the highest ever, trying to show a macro commitment to education overall.
Okay, that's the big picture. But what about the funds people worry about most, the maintenance money? for these partially aided Chinese primary schools. That's often the first place people look for cuts.
Right, that's a key area. So let's look at those figures Lee presents. For maintenance of partially aided Chinese primary schools, in 2022, under the previous administration, it was RM 46.57 million.
Okay.
In 2023, the first year under the unity government, it was RM 47.70 million, a slight increase.
All right. And more recently.
For 2024, the figure was RM 44.94 million. Now that looks like a dip.
Yeah, it does.
But Lee immediately adds that this was supplemented by a separate special allocation of RM 62 million, specifically for toilet maintenance across schools, including these.
62 million just for toilets. That's quite specific. Is that genuinely part of a systemic upgrade, or could critics see it as maybe a way to boost the numbers for that year?
That's exactly the debate, isn't it? Lee presents it as proof of ongoing substantial investment in school infrastructure tackling basic needs. It shows money is flowing.
Okay, so even if it's specific, it's still a significant resource injection. What about looking forward?
Looking ahead to 2025, the figures Lee gives are RM 47.80 million for primary school maintenance, plus, and this is new, an additional RM 5 million, specifically for partially aided Chinese secondary schools.
Ah, so expanding the scope slightly.
So if you take Lee's point, the overall trend in development allocations, whether for maintenance or construction, is upward, or at least consistently supported.
And crucially, he argues, the mechanism for funding new school construction is now inside that rolling plan structure.
Yes, that structural change is the heart of his institutionalization claim. It means future schools needing construction funds should be able to access them according to law and system, not by relying on political appeals each time.
It's presented as a shift from depending on political goodwill to depending on established policy.
That's the core message.
Okay, this whole discussion really circles back to the idea of fairness, doesn't it? Achieving education equity. To really grasp why institutionalization matters so much here, maybe we should quickly clarify the different school types involved.
Absolutely crucial distinction. You have the fully government schools, land owned by the government, fully funded, directly managed by the Ministry of Education.
Right, the standard model.
Then you have the government-aided schools. These are often on community-owned land managed by school boards, and the government funding historically covered only certain operational costs and sometimes teacher salaries, but not always land or major construction.
And that's the gap. That difference in status, particularly regarding land and who pays for big building projects, created the need for the old patronage system for these partially aided schools, right?
Exactly. They weren't automatically included in the government's main infrastructure budget for construction in the same way fully government schools were. They had to find other ways, often political ones.
So Lee is essentially saying the current government is trying to bridge that historical gap.
He's claiming they're actively working to dismantle it, at least for construction funding. By putting it within the Rolling Development Plan framework, the aim is to give these partially aided schools more equal access to construction funds, similar to their fully government counterparts.
The end goal being a different culture around school development.
Pretty much. The idea is that future school boards shouldn't have to spend their time begging or waiting for favors, as Lee puts it. They should be able to plan based on need, knowing a system exists to support construction.
Trying to make education planning less about politics and more about, well, rational educational needs?
Yes, it's framed as a long-term achievement, this institutionalization. It's not just about the ringgit amount this year, but about embedding fairness into the system itself, delivering education equity through policy structure.
So wrapping this up, the central argument from Howard Lee is this move from discretionary funding, one-offs tied to political connections towards a system that's nationally embedded, guaranteed by its place in the budget structure, and backed by consistent funding figures. Reform is supposed to make fairness more automatic, more systemic, no matter who holds political office. It raises a big question for you, the listener. What do you think about this push away from patronage, specifically in education? Is embedding these things in the system, in the bureaucracy, the only real way to get lasting equity for all kinds of schools in Malaysia? Remember to like and subscribe for more videos like this.